So, before we talk about the beautiful idea of culture, we have to finish up with the ugly idea of globalization. And I think I realized in the last class that I was going way overboard on a topic that you have probably given up on. But guest also is kind of a little bit, he's going to be globalization in every chapter. So we have to know a little bit about that. I chanced upon this article while I was thinking about the class because we were talking about the divide between China and the United States. So there was a time that China was simply producing all of our stuff, basically. But then people got afraid. And so they wanted to limit the technology that they can have. And so you may have known we banned this Huawei, I think, from making phones and selling them to us anyway. And it turns out that apparently the Chinese have been able to blast through and may even have something as fast as 5G that they have debuted on their own, despite the technology restrictions. So this goes with the idea that we talked about before, is this questioning of the idea of globalization, this steady march toward a faster and faster world, a smaller and smaller world, a more and more integrated world. And I gave you some examples of things, including the divide between the technology being used in China and the technology being used in the United States, perhaps. We don't know how that's going to turn out, as examples of ways of things that might make us question this narrative of steady globalization. Now, as I said in the last class, or I said in this class, probably I'm talking about something that in some ways it was a bit of a fad in the social sciences. The idea of globalization is probably on the way out as a fad word. And so I'm not going to worry about these debates too much. There have been a lot of debates about how long, how old is globalization? Is it still happening? Is it good? Is it bad? How much? And we can probably conclude from this that, first of all, you always have to be careful when you try and sum up an entire world or anybody with one word. But the key point to keep in mind here is that people have and always are interconnected, but we want to be careful about the specifics of that interconnection and not simply assume that it's always going in one direction. Now, what we did reach in the last class when I turned off the lights at the end of it and said, nobody's going to listen anymore, is that whatever we think about the processes of globalization and those debates, we must admit that we are confronting in our day and in the time to come, perhaps in the rest of our lifetimes, at least, issues that cannot be solved on a local or a national basis. So one of those issues, of course, is the climate crisis. In the, a few hundred years ago, if you wanted to keep your little locality clean and beautiful, then that was great. And it didn't really matter if somebody 100 miles away wanted to burn everything down and trash it all. It didn't really affect your life. You could still have a nice life. Whereas today we see countries that contribute very little to carbon emissions, for example, but are getting slammed by these kind of global issues. So these issues, this is one thing that obviously is not going to be solved on a country by country or a state by state or a city by city basis. Not to say that you shouldn't try to do something in your world, in whatever you can that you can control, but it has to be something that we think about on a global level. We were just starting to talk about the sweep of viruses and other things across national borders, as if those borders didn't even exist, even though people tried to clamp down on things. I don't know if you remember, it was in November or December, I think, of last year when the Omicron variant hit. And, it first showed up, or actually, we don't know that it first showed up there. The South African scientists were the first to figure out that it was there. It probably was already here. And so we tried to clamp down and stop people from flying around. But the next thing you knew, it was right here. So these things are not, again, they cannot be solved on a country by country basis. I think we've seen that imposing these kinds of restrictions, unless you live on an island, are very difficult to have in place. And so those are going to be global. Now, I wanted to also mention here that these issues are real. Now, that may seem strange to say, but what I think might be different about our current times, at least in this country, is that we have people who insist that these issues do not exist at all. Which is, I don't know, maybe that was always true. They just weren't so loud about it. But now they're very loud and they're very denying of these things. So we're going to try and insist they're real. If you have questions about their reality, we'll hopefully try to answer them. But for now, we're just going to say that they are real. Here's another one that people deny is real. And it's not only an issue in our own society, it is an issue as it is a global issue, as we saw with the global movement of solidarity and protest around the murder of George Floyd, that these occurred not just in the United States, but were part of an awakening in other places. The affirmation of indigenous identities, indigenous peoples, is something that has cross-national implications. It's globally interconnected and is going to be with us. A lot of people, perhaps even anthropologists, believe that these issues would go away as everybody became westernized, but they are not. Reproductive freedoms, issues around gender and sexuality are not just in the United States. This is something that is going on all over the world. You may have noticed that it's been a little bit in the news. The Spanish soccer team, unwanted, and say that Spain is going through its Me Too movement now. I think they're calling it the Basta, or enough of this unwanted kissing and attention that people get. And so these are issues that are not just in the United States. And in some ways, there are other countries that are much more, I don't know, they're being more advanced than us on some of these issues. We always think we're the most, but not on some of them. People having to move from place to place, being without a country or a state. This is, again, we see this it's played up on our southern border, but this is something that the Europeans have been in various ways grappling with and probably not doing too well on in some places. We've had a backlash of nationalist parties exactly against this idea of letting in people from other places. So all of these issues, whatever we think of whether or not the world is getting smaller or faster or smarter, all of these issues are not going to be solved by one place or one country alone. They are global, they are real, and we are also realizing that they are connected to each other, that the struggle for environmental justice can't be separated from the struggle for indigenous land and identity, or that disease and health cannot be separated from the struggle for racial justice, or that migration, being a refugee, is connected to issues of reproduction, gender, and the ways in which people are forced to move or attempt to move throughout the world. Within This was actually Amy's comment from last time, but it was a long time ago, so I won't pick on her about it. Within a system that seems to be able to quickly transform and reshape and get its fingers into local communities. That 1 second you're growing coffee, and the next minute you're like, nope, all the coffee's gone. We got to migrate and get out of here. So, again, I don't know that this is completely new. Finance capitalism does seem to move faster and fiercer than some of the, what we might call industrial capitalism, when people were more concentrated on making things. It does seem that being able to throw numbers around on a computer can mess with people's lives almost instantaneously and makes people's lives perhaps more precarious than ever before. For all of you gambling on Bitcoin, and get your whole life turned upside down in a few minutes. Yeah, and again, this is not something, the Bitcoin miners, for example, are all over the world.